There's a fluid your body produces that has no digestive function, no reproductive function, and no direct survival function, and yet it shows up at the most emotionally intense moments of your entire life. Scientists have a name for it. They just don't fully agree on why it exists. This is the strange, mostly unsolved story of human tears. Not the tears that show up when you cut an onion. Not the ones that leak out when wine hits your eyes on a cold morning or when you yawn too hard on a Tuesday. Those are basic lubrication, protection, mechanical response. Boring. Universal across the animal kingdom. Every mammal with eyes has some version of that system. We're talking about the other kind. The kind that shows up at a funeral. At a wedding. Watching a movie alone on your couch at 11 p.m. for reasons you can't fully explain to yourself, let alone anyone else. The kind triggered by nothing physical happening to your eyes at all, just a feeling, arriving from somewhere inside your skull, forcing its way out through your tear ducts like it has somewhere urgent to be. As far as we can tell, out of every species that has ever existed on this planet, exactly one of them does this. You. Not chimpanzees. Not dolphins, despite being some of the most emotionally complex animals we know of. Not elephants, who mourn their dead and remember individual humans for decades. Not dogs, who can somehow tell when you've had a bad day before you've said a word. None of them cry because they're sad. None of them cry because they're happy. None of them cry because of anything happening inside their heads instead of their eyes. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you a little. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes almost no sense. Let's start with the basic problem. Crying blurs your vision. At the exact moment you're most emotionally overwhelmed, grief, fear, heartbreak, the kind of moment where your ability to see clearly and react fast might actually matter, your body chooses that moment to flood your eyes with liquid and make you worse at seeing. It's also loud, sometimes. It's visible. To a predator or a rival, red eyes and a wet face are basically a flashing sign that says I am distracted and vulnerable right now. It costs your body water and salt for zero digestive or reproductive return. By every rule, evolution usually follows conserve energy, hide weakness, stay sharp during crisis. Emotional tears should have been quietly deleted from our species a long time ago. They weren't. If anything, they got more elaborate. So something about this trait was worth keeping. The question is what? Let's start with the plumbing, because before we get into why we cry, it helps enormously to understand what's actually happening when we do. Your eyes are covered, constantly, by a thin layer of what's technically called the basal tear film. This is the boring, always-on version, the one keeping your eyes moist and functional every second you're awake, whether you're thinking about crying or not. Then there's the reflex tear system, which kicks in for irritants. Dust, onion vapor, a poke in the eye. Different chemical composition, different trigger, different job. And then there's the third system. Psychic tears, or what most researchers now just call emotional tears. These come from the same physical structure, the lacrimal glands, tucked just above the outer corner of each eye, but they're triggered through a completely different pathway. Not through irritation of the eye itself, but through the limbic system, the emotional processing center of your brain, which somehow has a direct line to a gland whose only other job is basic eye maintenance. That connection is strange enough on its own. Your feelings are wired into your tear ducts. Sit with that for a second. Somewhere in your evolutionary history, a circuit formed linking raw emotional processing to involuntary fluid production on your face, and it stuck around for long enough to become universal to the entire species. One researcher, more than almost anyone else, tried to figure out what was actually inside that fluid. His name was William Frey, a biochemist at the University of Minnesota, and in the 1980s he ran one of the strangest and most genuinely fascinating experiments in the history of tear research. He collected tears. On purpose. From volunteers. Some of them were made to cry using onions. Some of them were made to cry watching deliberately tear-jerking films. Then he compared the chemical makeup of the two samples. They weren't identical. Emotional tears, according to Frey's analysis, contained measurably higher levels of certain proteins and stress-related hormones, including compounds linked to the body's response to psychological stress. In other words, when you cry because you're sad, your body isn't just leaking water. It's leaking something with actual biochemical fingerprints of what's happening inside you. Frey proposed something that still gets cited constantly today, even though it remains genuinely unproven, that emotional crying might function as a stress relief valve, physically flushing stress-related chemicals out of the body. The idea being that your tear ducts aren't just an emotional side effect. They might be a release mechanism, quite literally getting something toxic out of your system. It's a compelling theory. It's also, frustratingly, one that later researchers have had a hard time fully confirming. The amounts of hormone actually present in tears are tiny, small enough that some scientists argue there's no way they meaningfully affect your overall stress hormone levels just by leaving your body through your eyes. You'd probably get more stress relief from a hard exhale than from a full-on sob, chemically speaking. So the flushing toxins theory, while poetic, isn't the full story. Which means we have to keep looking. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the leading theories today have almost nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with something far more human. Communication. Think about what crying actually looks like from the outside. Someone's face changes color. Their voice breaks. Water visibly appears on their skin in a way that cannot be faked convincingly for very long. It's one of the very few human signals that is almost impossible to fully control on command. You can force a smile. You can hold back a scream. Genuine, sustained emotional tears are far harder to summon or suppress purely through willpower. And that involuntary quality might be exactly the point. Researchers studying the evolutionary psychology of crying, including work associated with psychologist Ad Vingerholtz, one of the most prominent tear researchers alive today, have proposed that emotional crying evolved primarily as an honest signal. Not a message you're consciously choosing to send, but one your body sends on your behalf, specifically because it's hard to fake. In a species that survived by living in tight social groups, being able to reliably signal genuine distress you're not performing, distress you actually can't hide carries enormous social value. It tells the people around you something true, at a moment when trust matters most. Here's the thing about honest signals in nature. The whole reason they work, biologically speaking, is that they're costly or difficult to fake. A peacock's tail is expensive to grow and maintain, so it reliably signals genuine health. A deep, resonant roar takes real lung capacity, so it reliably signals genuine size. Emotional tears might work the same way. Precisely because you can't just decide to produce them convincingly on command, when they do show up, everyone around you knows something real is happening. And there's a visual component to this that's easy to overlook. Tears don't just fall. They pool, they catch light, they make the eyes visibly glisten in a way that's noticeable even from a distance, even in low light, even across a crowded room. Some researchers have specifically studied the visibility of tears as a signal and found that a tear-streaked face is recognized as sad far more quickly and far more reliably than the exact same face with the tears digitally removed. The tears aren't incidental to the signal. They might be the signal. So who is that signal for? This is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the honest answer is probably other people, specifically the people closest to you. There's a theory, sometimes called the attachment or social bonding hypothesis, that suggests crying evolved out of infant distress calls. Human babies are born catastrophically helpless compared to almost every other mammal on Earth. A baby zebra can stand and run within minutes of birth. A human infant can't even hold its own head up for months. That helplessness meant early human infants needed an extremely reliable way to summon help immediately, and tears, paired with sound, became one of the most effective alarm systems evolution has ever produced. Loud, visually obvious, and nearly impossible to ignore. The theory goes that adult emotional crying may be, at its evolutionary root, a holdover of that exact same infant distress and summon mechanism, just carried forward into adulthood and layered with far more complexity. When an adult cries, on some very old, very deep circuitry, they might be running the same basic program a crying infant runs: something is wrong, I cannot fix this entirely on my own, please come closer. And it's worth remembering just how strong the infant version of that mechanism actually is, because it puts the adult version in perspective. A crying infant produces a sound specifically engineered, evolutionarily speaking, to be almost unbearable to ignore. Researchers who've analyzed infant cries acoustically have found they sit right in a frequency range that's maximally difficult for the human brain to tune out, even during sleep, even from another room. That's not an accident. That's millions of years of selection pressure making sure the caregivers who could ignore that sound simply didn't pass their genes forward as often as the ones who couldn't. If adult crying really is a descendant of that same system, it may be quieter and more restrained by comparison, filtered through decades of social conditioning about when and where it's appropriate, but the underlying wiring connecting distress to an involuntary, attention-demanding signal appears to be the same wiring, just running an adult version of a very old subroutine. And the truly interesting part is that it seems to work, even on adults, even now. Multiple studies have found that people consistently rate a crying face as more in need of support, and as more trustworthy and less aggressive, than the identical face without visible tears. Tears appear to soften how other people perceive you almost automatically, at a level below conscious reasoning. Your brain sees tears and adjusts its read of the situation before you've even processed what emotion is being expressed. There's an old phrase that's worth pausing on here, because it accidentally captures exactly how central this signal is to human trust. Crocodile tears. The idea of fake, insincere crying, weaponized specifically to manipulate someone. The phrase comes from an old and completely inaccurate folk belief that crocodiles cry while eating their prey, supposedly out of some twisted display of remorse. Crocodiles do, in fact, sometimes produce fluid near their eyes while feeding, but it has nothing to do with emotion. It's almost certainly just a mechanical side effect of the pressure involved in forcefully chewing. No grief. No guilt. Just plumbing. But think about why humans latched onto that image so hard that it became a permanent phrase in the language. We needed a word for fake crying specifically because real crying carries so much social weight that faking it convincingly enough to fool someone is considered a genuine act of manipulation, worth naming and warning each other about. You don't need a phrase for fake shrugging or fake sneezing. Nobody's worried about being emotionally exploited by a counterfeit yawn. But fake tears get their own idiom, in language after language, across cultures that never had any contact with each other. That alone tells you something about how much trust we place, instinctively, in the sight of someone crying. Which raises an obvious question. If tears are such a powerful, honest signal of vulnerability and a trigger for social support, why don't other deeply social animals do this too? Wolves live in tight cooperative packs. Elephants have complex, decades-long social bonds and clearly grieve. Dolphins recognize individuals and appear to comfort each other. If crying is such a good social tool, evolution had plenty of other candidates to hand it to. The honest answer is we don't fully know, but there are a few compelling ideas. One is that human faces are simply built differently for this kind of signaling. We have far more visible sclera, the white part of the eye, than almost any other primate, which makes our eyes uniquely good at broadcasting emotional information across distance. Tears against that white background are strikingly visible in a way they might not be against the eyes of, say, a chimpanzee, whose sclera is far less exposed. Some researchers argue our eyes essentially evolved into a kind of billboard, and tears may have piggybacked on that pre-existing visibility. Another idea ties back to something almost every episode of human history keeps circling back to: the sheer scale and complexity of human social cooperation. We don't just live in groups. We live in groups that require managing enormous amounts of social information constantly: who trusts whom, who owes whom, who is struggling and might need support redirected toward them before the whole group suffers for it. A reliable, hard-to-fake distress signal is disproportionately valuable in a species running that level of social complexity. Simpler social structures may simply not have needed it as urgently. There's also a flip side to all of this that rarely gets discussed: and it's arguably just as telling as the tears themselves: what happens when the signal gets suppressed. Across a wide range of psychological studies, chronic suppression of emotional expression, including crying, has been linked to measurably worse outcomes for both mental and physical health. People who consistently override the urge to cry, often due to social or cultural expectations around stoicism, report higher levels of ongoing stress and, in some studies, show physiological markers consistent with that stress accumulating rather than being processed. It's a strange kind of evidence, arguably stronger in its own way than anything found by directly studying tears themselves. If a signal exists specifically to communicate distress and mobilize support, and blocking that signal consistently correlates with worse outcomes, that's a reasonable clue that the signal was doing real work in the first place, even if we still can't fully map the exact mechanism by which suppressing it causes harm. Now here's something that tends to surprise people. Emotional crying isn't universal in the way you'd expect, even within our own species. Cross-cultural studies on crying frequency show real variation. Some cultures cry more openly and more often than others. Gender differences in reported crying frequency are large and consistent across most studied populations, though how much of that is biological versus cultural conditioning is still genuinely debated, and it's worth being cautious about drawing hard conclusions there. What is consistent, across basically every culture researchers have studied, is that the capacity to cry emotionally exists everywhere. The trigger threshold and the social permission to actually do it in public varies enormously. The underlying biological machinery does not. There's also a developmental piece to this that's easy to miss. Newborn infants cry constantly, but they don't produce actual tears when they do it for the first several weeks of life. The tear ducts responsible for emotional crying, specifically, typically don't become fully functional until somewhere around 2 to 4 weeks after birth. Which means for a brief window, human infants are running the distress call without the visual signal attached yet. The sound comes first. The tears catch up. And they stick around, in most people, for the entire rest of a human life. From an infant's helpless wail to an adult standing at a graveside, the same physical hardware, the same lacrimal glands, doing something almost no other species on the planet asks them to do. So let's pull all of this together, because there isn't one single clean answer here, and pretending there is would be dishonest. What we have instead is a handful of overlapping, mutually reinforcing explanations. Tears may have originated, biologically, as an infant survival mechanism, a hard-to-ignore alarm built to summon help for a creature that cannot help itself. That mechanism may have persisted into adulthood because honest, difficult-to-fake distress signals carry enormous value in a species whose survival has always depended on tight, trust-based social cooperation. The physical visibility of the human eye may have made us uniquely well-suited to carry that signal effectively. And whatever mild biochemical stress relief benefit exists on top of all that, however small, may simply have been a bonus evolution was happy to keep once the core signal was already locked in. What we do know, with far more confidence than any single theory about why, is this. It is old. The circuitry connecting raw emotion to involuntary fluid production on your face isn't something culture invented, and it isn't something you consciously chose. It was already running in every infant born anywhere on Earth, long before anyone had language sophisticated enough to ask why it was happening. It predates writing. It predates agriculture. It is quite possibly one of the oldest continuously running pieces of communication technology our species has ever had, and it doesn't require electricity, a language, or even shared culture to work. Show a tear-streaked face to a stranger from a culture you've never encountered, who speaks a language you've never heard, and they will understand instantly and correctly what it means. There's something worth sitting within that. For all the technology we've built to communicate language, writing, video calls, an entire species-wide internet dedicated mostly to arguing one of our most effective and universally understood signals still runs on nothing but salt water and a gland the size of an almond. No app required. No translation needed. Just water on a face, and somewhere in the brain of whoever's looking at it, an ancient, wordless recognition, something real is happening here. So next time it happens to you watching something stupid on your phone at midnight, standing in a room you didn't expect to cry in, blindsided by a feeling you can't fully explain. You're not malfunctioning. You're running code that's been part of this species since before there were words to describe what it was doing. You're not broken. You're just doing what humans have always done. You're signaling. What's the last thing that actually got you? Not the sad thing you expected to cry at, the random one that caught you off guard. Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you.